In the autumn of 1944, amid the grinding machinery of World War II, a transport ship cut through the Atlantic waters carrying an unusual cargo of prisoners. They were women, German women, nurses who had tended to wounded soldiers in field hospitals, secretaries who had typed orders in Wehrmacht offices, wives of officers captured in the European theater, auxiliary personnel who had served in support roles far from the front lines. They huddled together on the vessel, wrapped in blankets that could not quite ward off the chill of uncertainty. Fear gnawed at them more persistently than the cold. They were being taken to America, to enemy territory, to prison camps whose reputation preceded them only in whispers and propaganda. In their minds, they had constructed elaborate images of what awaited them: steel wire fences stretching endlessly under gray skies, guard towers manned by stone-faced sentries with rifles always at the ready, sparse meals of watery soup and stale bread, if they were fed at all, concrete barracks where the cold seeped through every crack. They had heard stories, rumors that circulated through the cramped quarters of the ship. Some said American camps were brutal, designed to break the spirit. Others spoke of labor camps where prisoners worked until they collapsed. The truth, they knew, would reveal itself soon enough. But in those days crossing the Atlantic, their imaginations filled the void with every possible horror. Then came the morning when smoke rose from a camp kitchen, carrying with it an unfamiliar scent. It was sweet, almost honey-like, with undertones of butter, and something earthy they could not quite identify. The aroma drifted across the compound, slipping through the windows of their barracks, curling around their senses with an insistence that demanded attention. They looked at one another with furrowed brows, uncertain what to make of this olfactory intrusion. This was not the smell of punishment or deprivation. This was the smell of something baked with care, something that spoke of homes and hearth fires. When they filed into the mess hall that noon, they found squares of golden yellow bread, waiting on metal trays. The surface glistened slightly, as though brushed with melted butter. Steam still rose from the freshly cut pieces. An American guard, noticing their hesitation, gestured toward the food with an almost casual encouragement. "Cornbread," he said, the word foreign and strange to their ears. "Go ahead. It's still warm." They approached cautiously, as one might approach any unknown thing in enemy territory. The first woman to take a piece broke off a corner and brought it to her lips. The texture was unlike anything she had known. Not dense and dark like the rye bread of her homeland, not dry and crumbling like the rations that had sustained them through the war years. This was tender, almost cake-like, with a subtle sweetness that melted across her tongue. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that instant, something shifted. The cornbread was not merely food. It was a message written in the language of nourishment and unexpected kindness. It was the first taste of a world that did not match the one they had been taught to fear. The war had brought them here, across an ocean, into the hands of those they had been told to hate. But this simple square of cornbread, warm and generous, spoke of something else entirely. It whispered of humanity persisting in the most unlikely places. It suggested that even in a prison camp, even between enemies, there could be moments of grace. And for these women, who had steeled themselves for cruelty, this small mercy struck deeper than any harsh word or cold cell ever could. It was the beginning of a journey they had not expected to take, one that would lead them from suspicion to understanding, from isolation to shared humanity. And it all started with the taste of cornbread, golden and warm, offered by the hands of those they had been taught to call the enemy. The journey to this moment had begun weeks earlier, in the chaos of a Europe being torn apart from east and west. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German-held territories in the final months of 1944, the number of prisoners swelled beyond what could be managed on European soil. Among them were women who had served the German war effort in various capacities. Some had volunteered out of patriotic fervor. Others had been conscripted, given little choice as the war dragged on and manpower grew scarce. There were 32 women in this particular group, ranging in age from 19 to 47, each with her own story of how she came to wear the uniform or serve the cause. Margaret had been a nurse in a field hospital near the Rhine. She had seen more blood and suffering than any person should witness in a lifetime. Clara worked as a translator in an administrative office, converting intercepted communications from French to German. Ruth had followed her husband to a base in occupied France, only to find herself stranded when his unit was captured. Anna had operated radio equipment for a communications battalion. Each woman carried within her a complex mixture of loyalty, doubt, fear, and the simple desire to survive. When they were gathered together and informed they would be transported to America, the news struck them like a physical blow. America was impossibly far away, a continent spoken of only in hushed tones by those who had relatives there before the war. It was the land of the enemy, yes, but also a place of almost mythical abundance and freedom that seemed at odds with everything they had been told. The propaganda had painted Americans as barbaric, as culturally inferior, as cruel captors who would show no mercy to German prisoners. Yet there were also whispered stories from soldiers who had been captured on the Western Front, stories that contradicted the official narrative, stories of cigarettes offered, of medical care given, of treatment that, while certainly imprisonment, lacked the brutality they had been led to expect. The Atlantic crossing took 8 days. The women were kept in converted cargo holds, separated from male prisoners. The conditions were cramped but not inhumane. They received regular meals, access to washing facilities, and medical attention for those who suffered from seasickness. Still, fear traveled with them like an unwelcome companion. At night, in the darkness broken only by the dim glow of safety lamps, they spoke in whispers about what awaited them. Would they ever see Germany again? Would they be treated as criminals or merely as prisoners of war? Would there be trials, executions, forced labor? No one had answers, only more questions that bred anxiety. When the ship finally docked at a port on the American East Coast, they were transferred to buses with covered windows. The journey inland took another 2 days, and through the small gaps in the coverings, they caught glimpses of a country untouched by war. Buildings stood intact. Roads were smooth and well-maintained. People walked the streets without the haunted look of those living under constant bombardment. It was jarring to see normalcy when all they had known for years was destruction and scarcity. The contrast planted seeds of cognitive dissonance that would grow in the days to come. The camp that became their new home sat in the middle of farmland somewhere in the American South. The exact location was never made clear to them, though some would later learn they were in Georgia or Alabama. As the buses pulled through the main gate, the women pressed their faces to the windows, desperate to see what kind of place would hold them. What they saw confounded their expectations in ways both subtle and profound. Yes, there were fences, tall chain-link barriers topped with coils of barbed wire that caught the sunlight and glinted like cold metal thorns. Yes, there were guard towers positioned at regular intervals around the perimeter, wooden structures rising above the fence line with clear views of the compound. Yes, there were armed soldiers, American men in olive drab uniforms who watched their arrival with expressions that were carefully neutral. But there was also something else, something harder to define. The barracks, while simple, were freshly painted. The grounds were neat, with pathways clearly marked and maintained. There were trees within the compound, real trees that provided shade. A baseball diamond occupied one corner of the camp, the bases visible from where they stood. This was not the hellscape of their imaginations. It was a place of containment, certainly, but one that seemed to acknowledge they were human beings rather than mere numbers to be processed. The first days unfolded in a haze of adjustment. They were assigned to barracks, given thin mattresses and rough blankets, issued basic supplies. The routine was established quickly. Morning roll call, work assignments, meals at designated times, lights out at 2100 hours. The American guards maintained a professional distance. They were not friendly, but neither were they cruel. They gave orders in English, sometimes supplemented by one of the few German-speaking personnel, and expected those orders to be followed. But there were no beatings, no random acts of violence, no deliberate humiliation. This, too, was disorienting. How could one reconcile the image of the barbaric enemy with this reality of methodical, almost bureaucratic imprisonment? The women clung to their identity as Germans, as if that identity were a life raft in an uncertain sea. They spoke only German among themselves, refusing to learn more than the bare minimum of English necessary to follow commands. They maintained the small rituals and hierarchies that had existed within their group. The older women, those who had held rank or position before capture, naturally assumed leadership roles. They organized the barracks, settled disputes, and maintained a sense of order that was both comforting and confining. They told themselves stories about German superiority, about the temporary nature of their situation, about the righteousness of their cause even as that cause crumbled in Europe. These narratives were armor against the unsettling kindness of their captors, against the growing realization that perhaps everything they had been taught was not entirely true. Among themselves, they shared rumors that circulated through the camp like viruses. One woman claimed she had heard from a male prisoner in an adjacent compound that American guards conducted secret executions at night. Another insisted that the food was deliberately poisoned, that they were being slowly killed. A third spread a story about medical experiments being performed on prisoners who were taken to the infirmary and never seen again. These tales found fertile ground in minds prepared by years of propaganda to expect the worst from the enemy. The fact that none of these horrors actually materialized did little to quell the rumors. Fear, once planted, grows in darkness and feeds on itself. There were small confrontations, moments when German pride collided with American authority. When Clara refused to salute an American officer, insisting she would show respect only to German military personnel, she was confined to the barracks for 3 days. When Anna tried to organize what she called a proper military structure among the prisoners, she was quietly but firmly informed that such activities would not be tolerated. When Ruth spoke defiantly to a guard, calling him a mongrel and invoking Nazi racial theories, she expected brutal retaliation. Instead, the guard simply walked away, his face impassive. Later, she would wonder if her words had even registered with him, if he had dismissed her hatred as the desperate posturing of someone already defeated. Yet beneath the surface of defiance and fear, something else was stirring. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable even to those experiencing it. But it was there, like the first green shoots pushing through frozen ground at winter's end. It was the quiet recognition that they were being treated not as monsters but as people. It was the growing awareness that their American captors, despite being on the opposite side of a brutal war, seemed to operate under a code that valued human dignity. This created a kind of psychological vertigo. If the enemy was not truly the enemy, then what did that make them? If kindness could exist across battle lines, then what did that say about the absolutes they had lived by? Into this atmosphere of tension and slowly shifting perceptions came the moment that would change everything. It arrived not with drama or announcement, but with the simple, ordinary occurrence of a meal. It was a Tuesday, or perhaps a Wednesday. The exact day would blur in memory, but what happened that day would remain crystal clear for decades to come. The women had finished their morning work assignments. Some had been sorting supplies in the camp warehouse. Others had been assigned to laundry duty or basic maintenance tasks. The work was not difficult, designed more to provide structure and purpose than to extract labor. As the noon hour approached, they returned to their barracks to wash up before lunch, a meal they usually approached with a mixture of hunger and indifference. The food at the camp was adequate, far better than what civilians in Germany were eating by late 1944, but it was institutional food, prepared in bulk with efficiency rather than care. But on this particular day, as they walked toward the mess hall, something was different. The air carried a scent that stopped them in their tracks. It was warm and inviting, distinctly sweet yet not cloying, with an underlying earthiness that spoke of grain and hearth. Those who had grown up in bakeries, or whose mothers had been passionate cooks, tried to identify the smell and failed. It was not the yeasty aroma of rising bread dough. It was not the sugary sweetness of cake. It was something else, something American in a way they could not quite articulate. The mess hall was a long wooden building with rows of tables and benches. The walls were decorated with nothing except safety posters and a large American flag at one end. The windows let in generous sunlight that fell in bright rectangles across the floor. The kitchen occupied the far end, separated from the dining area by a serving line where prisoners collected their meals on metal trays. Normally, the women moved through this line with mechanical efficiency, accepting whatever was placed before them without comment or expectation. Today, they slowed as they approached. The servers, American soldiers who rotated through kitchen duty, were placing squares of golden yellow bread on each tray alongside the usual soup and vegetables. The bread steamed gently. Its surface had an almost glossy quality, and here and there, small pools of melted butter caught the light. Margaret, first in line that day, stared at the piece placed on her tray. The soldier behind the counter, a young man who could not have been more than 22 or 23, smiled slightly. "Fresh cornbread," he said, though he must have known most of them would not understand the English words. "My grandmother's recipe." "Well, close to it." Margaret carried her tray to the usual table where her group congregated. The others joined her one by one, each bearing the mysterious yellow bread. They sat in silence for a moment, studying the food as if it might reveal its secrets through observation alone. Finally, Clara, the translator who understood English better than most, spoke. "He said it is cornbread, made from corn, I think, from maize. Maize? Ruth frowned. That is animal feed. They are giving us animal feed? It does not look like animal feed, Anna observed quietly. She had already broken off a small corner of her piece, examining it closely. The interior was slightly crumbly, but not dry. It held together well, and there was a moistness to it that suggested generous amounts of fat had been used in its preparation. It looks like cake, almost. One by one, they tested the cornbread. The first bite was always cautious, a small amount taken tentatively. Then expressions began to change, eyebrows raised, eyes widened. A few women closed their eyes involuntarily, the better to focus on the unexpected flavors unfolding on their tongues. The sweetness was gentle, not overwhelming. The texture was tender, almost melting. There was a richness to it that came from butter, from eggs, from cream perhaps. And underneath it all was the distinctive flavor of corn, nutty and wholesome, entirely different from the heavy rye breads or the sour sourdoughs of their homeland. For several minutes, no one spoke. The only sounds were the quiet noises of eating, of cutlery against metal trays, of people experiencing something that had no reference point in their personal histories. Finally, it was Anna who broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost wondering. "This is not prison food," she said. "This is what someone makes at home, for family." The observation hung in the air between them, impossible to ignore. Prison food was sustenance stripped of care, nutrition without love, fuel for bodies that needed to keep functioning. But cornbread like this, still warm from the oven, made with butter and sweetness and attention to flavor, this was something else entirely. This was food made by someone who cared about the experience of eating it. This was food that said, however quietly, "You matter enough for us to make this well." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. She had been a nurse, had cared for dying men who cried for their mothers, had held hands as life slipped away in field hospitals that reeked of blood and gangrene and despair. She had seen the worst of what humans could do to one another. She had developed a shell of professional detachment that allowed her to function amid horror. But this small kindness, this unnecessary gesture of making the bread sweet and tender when simple sustenance would have sufficed, cracked that shell in a way that brutality never could. Around the mess hall, other groups of prisoners were having similar reactions. A table of male prisoners, German soldiers captured in France, ate their cornbread with expressions of surprise and pleasure. Even the hardened veterans, men who had fought across multiple fronts, seemed taken aback by this simple bread. In the corner, a group of Italian prisoners who had been held longer looked on with knowing smiles. They had gone through this same moment of discovery, this same realization that American imprisonment came with unexpected mercies. Over the following days, cornbread became a topic of intense discussion among the women. Those who had some experience with cooking tried to puzzle out its composition. How much sugar? What kind of fat? Was there milk involved? Or water? The texture suggested a specific ratio of corn flour to other ingredients, but what were those other ingredients? The mystery of it became a kind of game, a mental exercise that occupied their thoughts during work details and in the evening hours before lights out. But beneath the superficial interest in recipes and techniques ran a deeper current of psychological adjustment. The cornbread forced them to confront contradictions they could no longer easily dismiss. If the Americans were truly barbaric, why did they feed their prisoners bread that tasted like home and comfort? If this was a nation without culture or refinement, how did they create food that showed such obvious care and tradition? If they were the enemy, why did the act of eating their bread feel less like submission and more like acceptance into something warm and nourishing? Margaret found herself thinking of her own mother's kitchen back in Bavaria. She remembered the smell of Sunday morning rolls baking, the way her mother would test the temperature of the oven by holding her hand inside for a count of 3, the ritual of breaking bread together at the table. Food had always been more than nutrition in her family. It had been connection, memory, love made tangible. And here, impossibly, in a prison camp in the American South, she was experiencing that same sense of food as connection. It confused her, it troubled her, and yet, she could not deny the truth of it when she tasted that cornbread. Clara, whose job it had been to find evidence of American barbarism in intercepted communications, found her certainties eroding with each meal. She had read propaganda about the degeneracy of American culture, about their lack of sophistication, about their supposedly inferior way of life. But the care that went into that cornbread spoke of a culinary tradition as real and rooted as any in Europe. It spoke of generations passing down recipes, of regional identities expressed through food, of pride in doing something well even when no one would have faulted you for doing it simply. Ruth, who had been the most vocally resistant to anything American, found that the cornbread awakened memories she had tried to suppress. She remembered childhood trips to her grandmother's farm, where meals were simple but abundant, where food was love spoken in the language of butter and flour and care. The cornbread tasted different from anything her grandmother had made, but it spoke the same language. It said, in ways words could not, that there were commonalities that transcended national boundaries, that the desire to nurture, to provide not just sustenance but pleasure, was something humans shared regardless of which side of a war they stood on. In the second week after the first cornbread appeared, something remarkable happened. Margaret, emboldened by curiosity and perhaps by the small kindnesses she had experienced, approached one of the American guards during a break from work duty. His name was Thomas, she had learned, and he was from a place called Tennessee. She used her limited English, supplemented by gestures, to ask about the cornbread. Her pronunciation was atrocious, mangling the English words into something barely recognizable, but Thomas understood. His face lit up in a way she had not seen before. The professional mask of the guard slipped, and for a moment, he was simply a young man talking about food from home. Cornbread, he said slowly, carefully, so she could follow. We make it in the South. Every family has their own way. My mama, she puts honey in hers, makes it sweet. Some folks like it plain, almost savory. My grandmother, she used nothing but buttermilk and bacon grease. You could eat a whole pan yourself. Margaret understood perhaps half of what he said, but the enthusiasm in his voice, the way his hands moved as he described his mother's cooking, needed no translation. She found herself smiling, actually smiling at an American guard, and the realization struck her with the force of a revelation. They were just people. These Americans, these enemies. They were just people who missed their homes and their mother's cooking, just like she missed hers. Word of this exchange spread through the women's barracks. That evening, as they sat on their bunks in the fading light, an unprecedented conversation began. Clara suggested, hesitantly, that perhaps they could ask to learn how to make cornbread. Anna immediately objected, saying it would be a betrayal of their German identity to embrace enemy food. But Ruth, surprisingly, sided with Clara. We are eating it anyway, she pointed out. And it is not as if we are betraying military secrets. It is just bread. The debate went on for hours, touching on issues far deeper than baking. It was about what it meant to be German in this strange place. It was about whether accepting the hospitality of captors made them collaborators or simply pragmatists. It was about pride and survival, about maintaining identity while adapting to reality. In the end, no firm consensus was reached, but the fact that the conversation happened at all was significant. A door had been opened, and while some still tried to keep it closed, others were beginning to peek through. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after the first cornbread appeared, an announcement was made during morning roll call. A cooking class would be offered for any prisoners interested in learning to prepare American dishes. Attendance was voluntary. Those who participated would work alongside camp cooks in the kitchen, learning recipes that they could make when they returned home. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some prisoners scoffed at the idea. Others saw it as a propaganda ploy. But several, including Margaret and Clara, saw it as an opportunity too interesting to pass up. On the designated day, 8 women gathered in the camp kitchen. It was a large space, much bigger than it appeared from outside, with industrial stoves, vast cutting surfaces, and enough pots and pans to serve hundreds of people. The smell of onions and herbs and baking bread filled the air. 2 American cooks, both older men who had been working in military kitchens for years, greeted them with nods and gestures toward aprons hanging on hooks. One of the cooks, whose name badge read Harrison, stood at the main counter with ingredients laid out before him. Through a translator who had been brought in for the occasion, he began to explain the process of making cornbread. First, he said, you need cornmeal. That is ground corn, dried and milled fine. We use yellow cornmeal, but some folks prefer white. Then you need flour, just regular wheat flour. Eggs. Buttermilk if you have it. Regular milk if you do not. Butter or lard. Baking powder to make it rise. A little sugar. A pinch of salt. The women watched intently as Harrison demonstrated measuring and mixing. His hands moved with the confidence of long practice, combining dry ingredients in one bowl, wet ingredients in another, then folding them together with a large wooden spoon. "You do not want to overmix," he cautioned through the translator. "Stir just until combined. Lumps are fine. Overmixing makes it tough." When he poured the batter into a greased pan and slid it into the oven, the women leaned forward, as if proximity would help them understand the magic that was about to occur. As the bread baked, Harrison told stories about cornbread in Southern cooking. He spoke of cornbread dressing at Thanksgiving, of cornbread crumbled into bowls of beans, of cornbread served with fried chicken and greens. The translator worked hard to keep up, and sometimes Harrison would pause, searching for simpler words, trying to bridge the gap of language and culture. When the cornbread emerged from the oven, golden and fragrant, the women were invited to try making their own. They divided into pairs, each pair assigned a station with ingredients. The kitchen filled with tentative laughter and the sounds of measuring cups clinking against bowls. Mistakes were made. Anna added too much buttermilk, creating a batter that was more soup than dough. Ruth forgot the baking powder entirely, resulting in a bread so dense it could have been used as a doorstop. But Harrison and his fellow cook moved between the stations, offering corrections with patience and even humor. Margaret, working with Clara, found herself actually enjoying the process. There was something meditative about measuring and mixing, about following a recipe that someone else had perfected over generations. When their cornbread came out of the oven, it was not quite as perfect as Harrison's, but it was recognizably cornbread, and when they tasted it, warm and crumbly and sweet, they felt a surge of accomplishment that had nothing to do with the war or nationalism, or any of the grand abstractions that had brought them to this place. As they worked, conversations began to flow more freely. Through the translator and with halting attempts at English, the women asked questions about American food, about regional differences, about family traditions. Harrison told them about church picnics where every family brought their best dish, about county fairs where cornbread was judged alongside pies and preserves. The other cook, a man named Samuel, spoke of growing up poor in Mississippi, where cornbread was often the main part of a meal, served with nothing but butter and maybe a little honey if they were fortunate. The stories revealed something the women had not fully grasped before. America, like Germany, was not a monolith. It was a collection of regions and traditions, of people shaped by geography and history and the slow accumulation of culinary wisdom. The South that Harrison and Samuel described had its own identity, its own pride, its own sense of how things should be done. In this way, they were not so different from Bavarians or Prussians or Saxons, each proud of their regional dishes and customs. Over the following weeks, cornbread became more than food. It became a kind of currency of connection. The women who had attended the cooking class shared what they had learned with others in the barracks. Some remained skeptical, refusing to participate in what they saw as fraternization with the enemy. But others, slowly, began to see the cornbread for what it was. Not a political statement, not a betrayal, but simply a good thing in a world that had precious few good things. Small interactions multiplied. Thomas, the guard from Tennessee, began leaving extra butter for the women's table in the mess hall. When Margaret thanked him in her broken English, he replied, "Cornbread is no good without enough butter. My mama would tan my hide if I served it dry." The phrase "tan my hide" was incomprehensible to Margaret, but his tone and his smile made the meaning clear enough. One evening, as the women sat in their barracks, Anna produced a piece of paper on which she had been practicing writing English. She had copied down the cornbread recipe phonetically, working from memory and with help from Clara's better grasp of English spelling. "When we go home," she said quietly, "I want to make this for my daughter. If she is still." She did not finish the sentence. They all understood. The uncertainty of what awaited them in Germany, of who would still be alive, hung over everything. But the recipe, carefully written in Anna's neat hand, represented something important. It was a bridge between worlds. It was proof that even in the darkest times, people could find ways to connect. It was a small act of defiance against the forces that tried to reduce them to categories of friend and enemy, us and them. Food, that most basic human need, became a reminder of shared humanity. The transformation was not universal or simple. Some women never wavered in their hostility toward their captors. Some maintained a rigid separation, refusing to see Americans as anything other than the enemy who had defeated their nation. But for many, the cornbread had opened a crack in their certainty, and through that crack, light was beginning to enter. Margaret wrote letters home when she was finally allowed to do so, months into her imprisonment. The letters were censored, so she could not write openly about conditions in the camp, but she found ways to communicate what mattered. She wrote of strange new foods, of bread made from corn that tasted like home even though it was nothing like German bread. She wrote of small kindnesses, of guards who were not cruel, of a country that had defeated Germany but seemed to hold no personal animosity toward individual Germans. The letters she received in return, when they finally arrived, spoke of devastation in Germany, of cities reduced to rubble, of food shortages so severe that people were eating grass and boiling shoe leather for nutrition. The contrast was stark and painful. Here, in a prison camp, she was eating cornbread with butter while her family in Bavaria struggled to find enough calories to survive. The guilt of that was immense, crushing at times. But intertwined with the guilt was a grudging recognition that the Americans, despite being her captors, were treating her with a humanity that her own government had failed to show to millions of others. It was a thought that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the barracks, wrestling with implications she could not fully process. As winter turned to spring in 1945, news from Europe grew increasingly dire for Germany. The Third Reich was collapsing from both east and west. Cities fell, armies surrendered, the grand promises of a 1,000-year Reich crumbled into dust and rubble. In the camp, the women heard these reports during occasional announcements, and the weight of defeat settled over them like a physical thing. What would they return to? What kind of Germany would exist when the war finally ended? Would there even be a Germany, or would the nation be carved up by the victors, erased from the map as punishment for the devastation it had wrought? In this atmosphere of uncertainty and grief, the simple rituals of camp life took on added significance. The meals, including the regular appearance of cornbread, became anchors of normalcy. The cooking classes continued, expanding to include other American dishes. The women learned to make biscuits and gravy, to prepare collard greens with ham hocks, to fry chicken in the Southern style. Each recipe was another strand in the web of understanding being woven between captors and captives. One afternoon in April, as Margaret helped prepare lunch in the kitchen, Harrison asked her through the translator why she had become a nurse. It was a personal question, one that went beyond the professional distance usually maintained. Margaret hesitated, then answered honestly. She spoke of wanting to help people, of believing she could make a difference, of the pride she had once felt in serving her country. She spoke, too, of the disillusionment that had come from seeing what war actually meant, from watching young men die for reasons that made less sense with each passing day. Harrison listened carefully, his face thoughtful. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "My son is in France," he said. "Fought across from your boys, killed some, saw his friends get killed. War is a terrible thing." He paused, measuring his next words. "But people are not war. People are just people, trying to get by." It was a simple statement, almost banal in its obviousness. Yet coming from this man, this American who could have chosen bitterness or hatred, who had a son who had fought against Germans, it carried profound weight. People are just people. The cornbread said the same thing, said it every time they tasted its sweetness, every time they saw the care that went into its preparation. People are just people. And sometimes, even enemies could recognize that truth in one another. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the camp, the news was met with a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the killing would stop, grief for all that had been lost, fear about what would come next. The women gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about the future. Would they be sent home immediately? Would there be trials? What kind of reception would they receive in a defeated, occupied Germany? The answer came slowly over the following months. They would be repatriated, but the process would take time. There were millions of displaced persons to be sorted, transported, resettled. In the meantime, they would remain in the camps, living in a kind of limbo between captivity and freedom. For some, this waiting period was agonizing. For others, it offered a strange respite, a chance to prepare mentally for the devastation they knew awaited them at home. As summer arrived, bringing heavy heat and humidity that the German women found oppressive, the camp routine continued. The cornbread appeared regularly, a constant in an uncertain world. One evening, as they sat outside in the relative cool after dinner, Ruth spoke up. She had been among the most resistant to any fraternization, the most insistent on maintaining pure German identity, but now she said something that surprised them all. "I think I understand the cornbread now," she said quietly. "It is not about the food. It is about what the food means. It means they see us, not as enemies, not as Germans, just as people who are hungry and far from home. And they feed us not just to keep us alive, but to give us something good, something that says we matter." The other women sat in silence, absorbing her words. After a long moment, Anna spoke. "When I get home, I will make cornbread for my family, and I will tell them about the Americans who fed it to us. I will tell them that even in a war, even in a prison camp, there were moments of kindness. I do not know if they will believe me." "I will tell them too," Margaret said. "I will tell them how cornbread taught me that the enemy is just a word we use for people we do not yet understand." As autumn approached, the first groups of prisoners began the journey home. The process was staggered, with those who had families in accessible parts of Germany departing first. Margaret was in an early group, scheduled to leave in mid-September. On her last evening in the camp, she returned to the kitchen where she had learned to make cornbread months earlier. Harrison was there, overseeing the preparation of dinner. Through the translator, she thanked him for his patience and his teaching. She told him she would never forget the cornbread, that it had changed something in her, opened her eyes to possibilities she had not known existed. Harrison listened, then disappeared into the pantry. He emerged with a small bag of cornmeal and a handwritten recipe card. "For your daughter," he said, "so she can taste a little bit of America." Margaret took the gifts with hands that trembled slightly. The bag of cornmeal felt heavy, weighted with significance beyond its actual mass. The recipe card, written in Harrison's careful cursive, was a document of transformation. She tucked both items carefully into her small bag of possessions, determined to carry them across the ocean, back to a Germany she barely recognized anymore. The journey home was long and complicated, involving multiple transfers and days of waiting in processing centers. When Margaret finally arrived in Bavaria, the devastation exceeded even her worst imaginings. Entire neighborhoods of her hometown had been reduced to rubble. People lived in cellars and makeshift shelters. Food was scarce, obtained through ration cards and the black market. Her family's apartment building had been partially destroyed, but her mother and sister had survived, living in 2 rooms of what had once been a 4-room home. The reunion was tearful and complicated. So much had happened, so much had changed. They looked at one another across a gulf of experiences that could never be fully shared or understood. But that night, in their cramped space with a hot plate for cooking, Margaret made cornbread. She had to improvise, substituting ingredients, making do with what was available. The buttermilk was replaced with watered-down milk mixed with a little vinegar. The butter was a precious tiny portion saved from their rations. The eggs were from a neighbor who kept chickens in the ruins of a bombed-out building. The cornbread that emerged was not as perfect as Harrison's had been. It was denser, less sweet, darker from the unbleached flour she had been forced to use. But when they tasted it, Margaret's mother and sister stopped chewing and looked at her with questions in their eyes. "This is what they fed you?" her mother asked. "In the prison camp?" Margaret nodded. And then she began to tell the story. She spoke of the surprise of that first taste, of the cooking lessons, of Harrison and Thomas, and the gradual understanding that had grown between captors and captives. She spoke of the contradiction of being treated with humanity by those she had been taught to hate, of the lessons learned through the simple medium of cornbread. Her mother listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Margaret finished, her mother was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "We were told so many lies, about so many things. Perhaps the truth is simpler than we wanted to believe. Perhaps people are just people, and kindness is possible even between enemies." Over the weeks and months that followed, as Germany struggled through the chaos of occupation and reconstruction, Margaret continued to make cornbread when ingredients were available. Each time, it was an act of remembrance, a way of honoring the unexpected grace she had experienced in captivity. Other women from the camp, those who made it home, carried similar stories. Some kept them private, uncertain how they would be received in a Germany trying to come to terms with defeat and guilt. Others shared them, adding their voices to a larger conversation about what the war had meant and what lessons could be learned from it. Years later, long after the immediate devastation had been rebuilt, after Germany had been divided and then eventually reunited, after the passage of time had softened some wounds while deepening others, Margaret would still make cornbread. She taught the recipe to her daughter, who taught it to her own children. And with each generation, the story was passed down, how cornbread, that humble American bread made from corn and kindness, had taught a group of German women that humanity could survive even in the heart of war. The recipe card that Harrison had given her, now yellowed and stained, remained a treasured possession. The words on it had faded, But Margaret had long since memorized both the ingredients and the method. More importantly, she had memorized the lesson that came with them. That food can be a language of connection, that small acts of kindness can change perspectives, and that even in the darkest times, people can choose to see the humanity in one another. In her final years, when grandchildren asked her about the war, Margaret would often end by making cornbread. As they ate it together, warm and sweet and redolent of butter, she would tell them the story one more time, and she would end with the words she had written in her diary on the day she left the camp, words that captured everything the cornbread had come to mean. I leave America with a strange memory. The enemy gave me the sweetest bread I have ever tasted. Not because they wanted to be kind, perhaps, but because that is simply how they make bread. And in that small fact lies a larger truth about the difference between governments and people, between nations at war and individuals trying to live with decency. I will carry this lesson and this recipe for the rest of my life. The taste of cornbread will always remind me that even in darkness, even in captivity, even between those who fought on opposite sides of a terrible war, there can be moments of unexpected grace, and sometimes those moments are the ones that matter most.